On today's episode, Josh and I are going to take you back to November 19th, 2004, and discuss the recently released documentary, Untold, The Malice at the Palace. Next.
Welcome back to the Two Pointers podcast. I'm Josh.
And I'm Trevor.
And welcome back. So today is a very different episode than Trevor and I usually do because, well, frankly, I didn't want to talk about the Summer League today, if I'm being honest. And so this past week, or maybe the week before, I don't know by the time we're recording, documentary was released on Netflix, Untold, Malice at the Palace. It's one of those stories that has always massively intrigued me in the NBA because it's the most outrageous incident in the past 20 years that the NBA has gone through. And because I don't think it's talked about these days at all. I personally didn't really know the backstory. The NBA has definitely tried to kind of, I guess, sweep it under the rug like it's there. Everybody knows it's there, but the NBA doesn't want to talk about it because it's kind of an embarrassing moment. And so I thought, what a perfect time, especially from this past playoffs with everything happening with fans running on the court, throwing water bottles, things at players. It's time to discuss what has happened in the past when that has happened. So it's a roundabout way to say we're going to talk about Malice at the Palace and what happened when Ron Artest ran into the stands in Detroit in the Palace at Auburn Hills.
Very intelligent game tonight. Then Wallace is fouled, and Wallace did. Oh, Wallace right at our chest. This has potential to be serious if they don't get between. Wallace upset. Players trying to hold each other off. Steven Jackson and Rasheed Wallace trying to be peacemakers. Now Jackson yelling. Wallace still going. You need the coaches in there to get him away. Jackson challenging Derek Coleman. Somebody should just get Jackson out of it quickly as possible. The problem is, if Wallace is ejected, I'm not sure. He'd have to walk past the Pacer bench to go. Now Artest has jumped over the scorer's table and is trying to get down to the bench. Artest is in the stands.
So, Trevor, what do you think of immediately when I say Malice at the Palace?
So, as an NBA fan / I don't want to call myself historian, but first thing I think of genuinely is, first of all, when David Stern walked up at many points in the documentary, it really made me think of, like, obviously this is a little bit before our time. We're going to date ourselves on this. I don't physically remember this. I remember the following months after it, as I started watching basketball more that year. That was actually the year I started watching basketball, which is funny to think. But David Stern truly, my first thoughts just reactionarily watching this documentary, because we all have seen things about it, but there's never really been a true showing about it in terms of just hour-long sit-through. But what a final true test for Stern, as like this was kind of like the mid to end of his like last little blemish here of like, because as he started to transition power in the early 2010s to Adam Silver, who we currently have, obviously. We'll get into in detail what happened with Stern with the decisions based on the result of the riots, but it's just wild to think that this was the last like really hard blemish on the NBA and how they had to kind of understand how the image of the league was going to change. So honestly, I forgot a lot of the things I previously knew about it, but it was almost like eye-opening. That was kind of my first reaction. If I just had to give you, like, since we're going to break it down in detail, it's like just eye-opening.
Yeah, I think for you, what I think of, I mean, it's one of those crazy NBA fights. It's the crazy NBA fight. Let's be clear. It's the last, I want to say, kind of one from a bygone era in the NBA where there used not to be as much like legislating or officiating players getting physical with one another. I mean, that's why the bad boy Pistons happened in the first place, right? Like, players were incredibly physical. Bill Laimbeer's whole job was just to hit people, frankly. And we're kind of in that last part of there where the NBA really had to take a stand and decide what kind of league they were going to be. And I don't think I'd realized, I guess when talking about the documentary, how much negative press there was around the situation towards the players. But we'll get into that as we go.
We'll open that can of worms in a little bit, but like, I think a lot of people, and if you haven't watched it, this is like the one time at the very beginning we're going to say, please go watch it. Mm-hmm. Because don't watch it before this, but I guess if you want to watch the documentary first and then hear our thoughts, obviously, please do so. But I didn't realize the cultural phenomenon or the cultural change or the cultural shift based on that. And we'll get that in detail because obviously it's a basketball game at the end of the day. We want to kind of open it up with the fun part of it, I guess, necessarily, right? What led to or how those two teams got on the court. I think that was a big reason we had talked about off recording. But yeah, I'm interested to see what people think after watching this based on and give your thoughts on Twitter, please. Everybody who's listening to this at 2 Pointers, let us know what you thought about just the overall landscape of how the league was looking at this series. But overall, Josh, let's open up with the basketball fun of it. The kind of like how these two teams got to this point and why they might have fought.
Okay. There's plenty of reason we know why they fought, but we'll get through it. So I want to kind of lay the background where the NBA is at this point. Michael Jordan has retired, and so we're into a new era in the NBA. This is past. Michael Jordan is finished with the Wizards, I believe, in 2003. So MJ is gone. The Bulls are no longer a dynasty. The Lakers have had their early 2000s three-peat, and we're kind of on the back end heading out of that Lakers dynasty with Kobe and Shaq. And into that place slides two teams. One, the Indiana Pacers, who are kind of at the center of our conversation, led by an aging Reggie Miller, who had not quite been able to kind of reach that mountaintop throughout his career because he was battling Michael Jordan's Chicago Bulls in the East. And so he'd never been able quite to get to that mountaintop. And the young Detroit Pistons, led by kind of their awesome starting five of Chauncey Billups, Richard Hamilton, Tayshaun Prince, Rasheed Wallace, and Big Ben Wallace. So the story starts for the Indiana Pacers. Now that there's kind of a hole left in the Eastern Conference, there's a hole left in the NBA. The Pacers are going out to build a team. They bring in a young Jermaine O'Neal in a trade from the Portland Trailblazers, who isn't getting a lot of playing time in Portland, and he slides into Indiana to learn under Reggie Miller and quickly starts to reach an all-star level as a basketball player. And with Reggie Miller and Jermaine O'Neal in Indiana, the Pacers quickly start to rise to the top of the Eastern Conference, and they're trying to put together a team that can make a run at the title. They then acquire Ron Artest, and they bring him to Indiana. And Ron Artest, the most controversial player since Dennis Rodman in the NBA, slides into his role in Indiana.
It's a great comparison, by the way.
Well, so that's one of the things, and we can kind of get into that now. As I was watching the documentary, and obviously I think this documentary has legs. We're starting to see that the reason a documentary like this could be made is because Last Dance did so well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Last Dance did amazingly, and so people are saying, oh, we can go make these basketball documentaries and tell these stories that people aren't seeing. And so off the back of The Last Dance, they make this. And man, Ron Artest is just like Dennis Rodman in play style and in personality. I mean, he's not the eccentric loves the limelight guy quite as much as Rodman is. I mean, he's not dating Madonna. He's not wrestling in WCW, but
Carmen Electra.
Yeah.
None of that. But he's kind of, everyone thinks he's off. Everyone thinks he has a bit of a screw loose. What are your thoughts on Ron Artest? I know that as your late 2000s time watching the Lakers, you were very familiar with Ron Artest. Oh, I love Ron, man. He was so much fun on that team. I'll never forget the Wheaties press conference where they just won I believe it was the 10 title. It was the final one. And he walks up and he's like, man, I got my Wheaties. He was so excited, man. He always has had a screw loose. And I mean that in the most respectful way possible. It's funny you say the Dennis Rodman comparison because that was my first thoughts when they cut away to Ron wanting time off the court. And I'm going to segue this in two ways. Obviously, if you watch The Last Dance, you and I both have, and I think I'm going to probably go back and rewatch it at some point here in the near future, with the offseason being here and summer league being summer league. I think a lot of people realize, like, personality wise, yes, they're the same on the court. Quite frankly, other than the rebounding difference, obviously with Rodman being one of the best rebounders of all time, basketball wise, I think they're very similar. I think off the court, however, I think they're completely different. I think what I mean by that, personality is one thing, right? They both have, this kind of edge to them, whether it's off the court or on the court. But what I think a lot of people, and I'm just going to be the first one to touch on this, is I think a lot of people, and I'm glad the documentary did this, and I know Jermaine O'Neal in a lot of interviews, there's a lot of great interviews of him right before this release on Hot 97 was one of the ones I watched, just kind of highlighting it. But just the mental health landscape of the NBA that's different from now to then. And even just in general, I'm going to read 3 people just off the top in the last 2 years that we know have come out. And there isn't a long list of athletes, but these are the ones recently, 2 of them being NBA players. Kevin Love has been very open about his mental health struggles and depression. DeMar DeRozan, that one kind of surprised me because he seems like we always thought he was kind of that Kawhi Leonard, quiet type guy. And then obviously recently with the Olympics and Simone Biles. So I think we really knew something was there with Artest, and his teammates did. He had a psychiatrist on the road with them. Like, that's like Brady having his TB12 guy on the road with him. Like, the team was used to that. The environment was used to that. And the fact that Artest, or obviously now Meta World Peace, I think it's eye-opening in every way. I think this documentary, if I had to give you like one word, it's eye-opening. And I think that was one of the first things that I noticed. And they were very early on about that. They were very clear that, like, he's open and talking about that, and he's able to understand like what was really going on. And that was kind of his moment that I think flipped a lot of things for him in his life and his basketball career, obviously.
Yeah, I think definitely what this documentary, I really enjoyed kind of understanding Ron Artest more. I understand him a lot more through everything. And people kind of refer to him as the guy that had the screw loose more because he's a short-tempered guy, which a lot of these guys in Indiana were. Jermaine O'Neal was as well, as we'll see as we get through.
Steven Jackson.
Well, we hadn't gotten Steven Jackson yet, but we'll get there.
Okay, all right.
He comes in later in the story. But I appreciated understanding what was going on with Ron Artest. And I really hate it for him looking at the time that he was he was trying to get out from that situation in Indiana at the time anyway. He was getting help with his therapist, but I mean, it's the reason, like you said, he was asking for time off because he was kind of trying to step away from the spotlight. And that's that big difference that we talked about between him and Dennis Rodman is Rodman kind of chased the spotlight everywhere with his time off and everything. He was kind of just a bit of a wild card. And Artest, I think, really just kind of wanted to get away to figure things out and then come back. And that's what he was able to do later in his career when he left and he went to the Lakers. He was able to kind of step back, figure things out, and come back and have like a really great career in the NBA. Where I wish for him that he hadn't gotten caught up in the situation that got blown out of proportion before he kind of got that chance to step back and figure that out.
So 2 things on the Artest side, so we can keep moving through the story, because I think there's a lot to cover in this. Is it's funny you mentioned the Bulls at the very. You kind of opened this with the tie to the Last Dance and the tie to the fact that this is the year. Well, so it's the season. It's the 2004-05 regular season, right? So it was, the Pistons had already won the title. We'll get to. I'm sure we'll cover part of that and why that kind of correlated in a little bit. But Artest was traded from the Bulls. I don't think a lot of people realize that, right? As the Bulls were dismantling from that 2001 to 2003 range when Jordan was obviously on the Wizards by then. There was even a quote, and I tie this into Artest for a reason. This is my last point on him, and just kind of, he's always been that funny, like, quotable guy, whether the screw loose or not, right? So the 2 quotes I loved that I got from this was obviously on the way to the locker room, and I guess we're not there yet, but this is an Artest thing. On the way back to the locker room, as everyone's being like held back and yelling stuff. We'll get to other guys, but Artest is like, "Are we going to get in trouble for this?" I'm like, yeah. And then he also was quoted, I believe, is it Donnie Walsh? Is that the name I get tied up, the Pacers owner? I get confused multiple, but regardless, Pacers owner at the time. Obviously, Larry Bird was the acting president at the time as well. But Artest was quoted the day after getting traded from the Bulls as saying, "Thank goodness the Pacers saved me from losing in Chicago. I was getting tired of those 2 or 3 years." Yeah. And he doesn't want to lose. He wants to win. Ultimately, he wants to win. And I thought that was funny that he verbalized that in those interviews. So Artest, man, obviously as a Lakers fan, I've got a different love and relationship for him. But yeah, man, what a fun guy. What a fun, just all around basketball player in terms of just the actual basketball side of things.
So I guess we'll kind of roll into what happened toward the end of that 03-04 season. So the Pacers do create, this powerhouse. They've got Reggie Miller, who is still one of the, he's older. He's about 33, 34, kind of the tail in his career. You have Jermaine O'Neal, you have Ron Artest, two really young guys. Jermaine O'Neal, an all-star big man, and Ron Artest, one of like a first team or second team all defensive player in the NBA. And so the Pacers and the Pistons both kind of played this very gritty defensive style, and they meet in the Eastern Conference Finals. And the Pistons pull it out 4-2. One of the big reasons is late in Game 6, Ron Artest. They said in the documentary that he got frustrated and he just made a mistake or had a mental lapse by bringing his elbow up. But to me, it just looked like he was playing defense and he didn't mean anything at all. And Richard Hamilton kind of just ran into him. And I would have been really frustrated if I were Ron Artest getting thrown out of the game for that. But he's kind of pushing and shoving Richard Hamilton, and Hamilton comes to drive in the lane, and Ron Artest brings his hand up, and Hamilton just kind of runs head first into his elbow. And Artest gets ejected, and the Pacers lose the game, and the Pistons go to the finals where they make short work of the Lakers in 5 games and win the championship. Which leads us into the next year, where it's kind of Reggie's last chance.
18 seasons.
Yeah, it's Reggie's last shot for a Hall of Fame caliber player to get that title in the team that he spent his whole career with. And the Pacers go out and they look for that one final piece, that one extra person that we want to grab to kind of form a team that's going to have a shot at the title, and they bring in Steven Jackson. And Steven Jackson is really a walking bucket at the time. He's going to make everything that he puts up. And Steven Jackson also has a bit of a reputation for having a short temper. In addition to Ron Artest and Jermaine O'Neal, who also have reputations for having short tempers.
And Jamal Tinsley, by the way. People forget Jamal Tinsley on that team.
Oh, he's important in this story, too. We'll get to what Jamal Tinsley did.
I love it.
Because I think Jamal Tinsley might be a lot to blame for what happened here. But, and by the way, when I'm saying that they all had short tempers, this is all from the documentary.
They were open about that. They were pretty open and honest about that.
They were pretty open about that. And so that brings us to November 19th, 2004. It's the first regular season matchup, a very young season, between the Pacers and the Pistons in Detroit at the Palace at Auburn Hills. It's kind of, everyone thinks it's the Eastern Conference Finals preview. Again, like these are the two best teams in the league. And so the Pacers come in and they've had some issues with chemistry, frankly. The Jermaine O'Neal and Ron Artest have really not been seeing eye to eye at this point. Steven Jackson's new to the team and kind of working into the team dynamic in Indiana. And Reggie Miller playing the veteran influence with these young players. You got to realize these guys were almost all, Jermaine, Ron, and Steven Jackson were almost all like 23 or 24. They were about 10 years younger than Reggie. Reggie's kind of playing the coach. They come into the Palace at Auburn Hills. Reggie's hurt. Reggie doesn't play. But they get it together, and they are just crushing the Pistons. The Pacers are running the Pistons out of the building. And they've got about a 17 or 18-point lead.
To the second quarter, by the way. To the second quarter, they had at some point. They had a big lead.
They killed them in the game. The Pacers were showing they were the best team in the NBA. And They've got about a minute and a half to go. The game's in the bag. Pistons fans are starting to leave the arena, a lot of them. There's a timeout, and they're going to come back. The Pistons are going to inbound the ball. And here's where Jamal Tinsley comes into the story. The story was told from Jermaine O'Neal's perspective, who's standing talking with Ron Artest. And Jamal Tinsley comes to Ron and says, "You can get your foul now." But you got to understand there's a lot of bad blood between the Pistons and the Pacers. There's a lot of pushing. The Pacers had their dreams crushed the year before by this team. And we talked about the Pacers guys being short-tempered. The Pistons were similar ways with Rasheed Wallace and Ben Wallace weren't afraid to get in a fight. It was just the way the NBA was at the time. A lot of the big men on the teams were there kind of as enforcers, and there were a lot of fights in the NBA at the time. Those pushing and shoving bouts that the NBA suspends guys for now was just nothing at the time. No one would get suspended for that pushing and shoving match back in 2004. And Jermaine O'Neal, just kind of hilariously, him telling the story of Jamal Tinsley coming around saying, "You can get your foul now." And Jermaine's like, "Why would you even tell him that?
Why would you spark a fire that's already
He's
started?"
Like, we don't need this. And the next play, it's a 15-point game with 40 seconds.
By the way, don't brush over the fact that it was the literal next play. It wasn't like he missed an opportunity. This was Ron "Hey, Ben, you ain't getting no layup."
And Ben Wallace, he gets the ball low. He's going to go in for the layup. Steven Jackson tells the story of saying, Steven Jackson says, "He got by me. I wasn't going to even go after him. It's a 15-point game with 40 seconds. Big Ben goes up for the layup, and Ron Artest just hits him in the back. And so Big Ben comes back, rightfully so, and they start shoving, and they everything kind of blows up with players on the court, and there's whistles blown. Everybody's trying to get in between Ron and Ben Wallace as they're going towards the scorer's table. And at this point, nothing's really out of control. It was kind of something that was expected, especially with these teams and how hot the game was. And the Pistons are probably frustrated because the game hasn't gone their way, being the defending champions on their home court. And it looks like they're going to get under control. Everybody's in between everyone. And Ron Artest kind of, because he's been backed up by the crowd to the scorer's table, lays down on the scorer's table. And I really enjoyed seeing Ron Artest's perspective on this, is that he said, because you talked about the therapist was on the road with him at the time, and he says the reason that he does this is he's trying to practice conflict de-escalation, I think is what it was. And then he's taking a second away and he's counting in his head and he's trying to just move out of the situation.
So funny you say that, because the fans didn't realize that, obviously.
No, I didn't know that until now, until hearing Ron Artest's story for it.
Yeah, I thought maybe, we all thought at the time, is he doing this just to piss people off more? He was getting out of the situation. That was pretty obvious, right? But the fans just in the moment were and that was kind of how the security, we'll get to them in a moment. They I love their perspective. We got some cops' perspectives and we got some security perspective. I think there was some funny quotable things in there, just looking back on it. But anything the players did, you mentioned how it was a normal game. Their fans had started leaving. There was still north of 8,000 fans in that arena.
Well north of that, yeah.
And I believe they said the number. I saw the number at some point, but it was north of 10 still. But their arena could hold almost 20,000 people, and it was just funny because the fans were looking at it from this perspective of okay, Ron's just trying to piss us off. Ron's just doing this thing to antagonize us. He's laying on the scorer's table. A lot of the Detroit front office people thought that was disrespectful. And I'm glad that, I agree with you. I'm glad they really understood and highlighted, why he was doing that in a moment. And you watch it back again, even if they don't tell you that, you could see him, talk to himself. And I thought maybe he was just talking to himself because he might have been crazy. But Ron really, tried to be the bigger person here prior to it, obviously.
Well, yeah. Try to be the bigger person after starting the fight. But, well.
Yeah, I guess.
And so, you take it from the outside perspective, he's laying down on their scorer's table, which it's kind of like you hit the big shot in a game and you jump on an opposing team's scoring table and kind of gloat to the fans. It's not a good look. The Pacers coaches were saying Ron lays down the scorer's table and that was strange. And that was not something that had happened before, and everyone was kind of confused. And then the beer comes flying from really a long ways away.
We're
and I
talking
have
like
to say,
8 rows back.
I'm not saying that this is a good thing. Like, I think the fan that did this, it was despicable. But what a throw, right? Like, I have to say, like, just the fact that he hit him flush from how far away he was. Like, not just 8 rows back, like, he was
elevated
down, like, far to the right. Like, he was elevated up 8 rows and then, like, 15 or 20 feet to the right. On the other side of the court. And he hits him perfectly with this beer that he throws.
And by the way, like north of like 50% of that cup's still full. It was very impressive. It was very impressive.
That's the thing that really got to me is the fact that it could have so easily just not hit it, right? Like this whole thing goes differently if the guy doesn't make a perfect throw to hit it.
So you highlight the guy, and I'm going to give him, I'm going to say his name, and here's why.
Yeah.
I think it's
his name in the documentary. So.
Plenty of times. And I think it's important. By the way, they like had the suspense built up as if we didn't know who it was. Mm-hmm. Like it was really, I liked how they did that because they didn't give him much airtime like he didn't deserve, clearly. But I'm going to highlight his name, John Green, not to be confused with other John Greens that are infamous or famous in the world. There's a lot of John Greens. But this John Green specifically is still banned to this day, if I'm correct. And I haven't found it. Now, I did a lot of digging for this. I wanted to make sure I got this right because I was really curious. There's still not a confirmed piece of documentation that says he is banned by the NBA, but I would guess that he's still banned from the NBA to this day, as obviously a diehard Pistons fan. Not much to be going to see games in Detroit right now until about 2-3 weeks ago. But regardless, John Green with like the all-time quarterback of a pass. And if you watched it, like I love the slow-mo angle because you just like see everyone like watch it. They described it in they're like,
Reggie Miller says like time. He's like, and I see it tumbling. Almost like because Reggie's saying like I see it in like slow motion.
Steven said it was the longest moment of his life, longest 5 seconds of his life.
Yeah,
which is crazy to think like that perfectly happened, which changed the next at least 10 years of the NBA and possibly some NBA history. Like honestly, that throw changed a lot.
It completely influences a lot of the NBA now. And so I think we kind of like we dwell on this part of what happened here because it was like the eye of a hurricane almost, where it's that moment of quiet. Everything's gone quiet before everything completely explodes. And because the beer hits Ron Artest and any sense of calm that he had worked was completely gone. And I completely agree with him. Like I'm going to state very clearly that I'm entirely on Ron Artest's side here, for the most part, because he got like it's despicable. He got assaulted. You can't dump something on a player, especially one who's been charged up late in the game. They're in a shoving match between the two players, so tensions are high, and then you're gonna dump a beer on him and throw something at him. Yeah, I mean, he clearly loses it, and there's nobody in between Ron Artest and going into the crowd, and he hops off the scorer's table and runs up. And the thing that the person I feel bad for is that Pistons fan that's standing beside John Green, because Ron Artest doesn't hit John Green. He doesn't realize John Green threw it. He runs past John Green and hits the guy next to him full force. And he's attacking him there. And so the video at that point is just kind of fuzzy because everything's going crazy. You see Ron Artest there, and when he hits the guy, Pistons fans just fall on top of him. There's a massive crowding in to protect. And then you see Steven Jackson fly in from the side to help Ron Artest. And I think the one thing that we see that is different and why we talked about these players having such high tempers is that there was no one on the team to de-escalate the situation. Steven Jackson is not running in the stands to stop Ron Artest. He is running in the stands to stand beside him and fight all of the Pistons fans with him. And that's where things escalate.
Just to quote Steven Jackson as they go back to the locker room, "We ride together, fam."
Yeah.
So one thing to highlight about the fact that John Green just like coward, was such a coward, and like I'm trying to think of the adjective version of coward, and I can't talk, but like he just moves out of the way.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to make amends to the fact that like a couple things. One, you mentioned like the eye of the hurricane thing. I think that's a great analogy. I think the documentary really highlights that. Obviously, it's a very dramatic. The music's really good. They did a great job with the cinematic aspect of it. But if you watch just on YouTube, if you go to YouTube, and I did this just to understand the full picture, if you YouTube Malice at the Palace and you watch what we have available to the public, and I won't spoil that part of the documentary. They highlight the public visual version versus the what we see in the documentary, but you don't realize like it calms down. Like when you say eye before the hurricane, like eye in the hurricane thing, like it for the most part had Wallace is still trying to Ben that is still trying to get it Ron a couple minutes there, but like for the most part it really got to a point where they had this down to like coaches pushing people back and it was ready to go to the locker room or ready to finish the game. Obviously it was like 40 seconds left, and I can't get over the fact that like John just moved out of the way. Like I get you're just going to try to like, okay, Ron Artest is coming at you. Like you could probably get killed here, but like the other guy just gets like destroyed at the expense of John Green's like $5 beer. So I think I'm not going to highlight any more on John Green other than the fact that I don't think a lot of people know this, but him and Artest actually made up in 2009. That's my favorite part about doing these kind of things is like doing some research behind the documentary because I want to know what they didn't cover. I'm going to give CBS credit for this. On the 15-year anniversary, they did a just a little breakdown of some interesting things that they found doing some digging. And John and Artest in an interview in 2009 had actually since apologized to each other and kind of came to amounts. I don't know if actually Artest ever kind of solidified anything with the guy he accidentally thought was John Green. I don't really know what happened to him. I don't think they actually ever highlighted it in the documentary either, but he basically just gets beat to a pulp. But it got to a point so much with their makeup when Artest started to transition to the Meta World Peace thing, which a lot of people I think don't realize like the change there, possibly. But they agreed to a charity event in a way to make amends, but they never went through with the actual event. So I just thought that was interesting that John and Ron, now Meta, came to amends by trying to do charitable works together after changing the shape of NBA history.
Okay, so I found it. The name of the fan that was hit was named William Paulson.
Yeah, they didn't highlight him whatsoever in the doc. I don't believe.
Yeah. And so like there's not much to because I think he gets beaten up kind of a bit by Artest and Jackson. Well, Jackson hits a different fan. So just to be clear, that Artest is then like once he hits Paulson, all the other fans, including John Green, like converge on Artest because now they think it's us against them at that point, which the fans had been whipped into this mentality that it's us against them. This is the real fight kind of thing with the shoving match on the court, which is kind of what it's incited the situation. I think like Jermaine O'Neal made a good point when he was talking about what's happening. The fans don't realize that these players are mostly all friends. It's what the fans like aren't realizing. All they see is these guys look like they really want to fight, like they're really going to go at it. And the Pistons fans, they think it's us, it's not them, it's us, it's our team, it's Detroit, and they're going to fight for their team, and so they get physically involved in it at that point. And after that, it's Pacers players Eddie Gill, David Harrison, Reggie Miller, who's injured and in a suit, Fred Jones and Jamal Tinsley, and then Rasheed Wallace of the Pistons all follow Ron Artest and Steven Jackson into the stands. Jermaine O'Neal stays on the court. All of them follow them into the stands to try and pull them out, frankly. And they are, for the most part, able to get them out. John Green does actually have a physical altercation with Artest in the stands, but they are able mostly to get them out, and they're pulling them back down. But that's not where things end. I think that's where one thing I learned from the documentary is what's often shown is that's kind of like people see as once they pull them out, like that's what happened. That was Malice's boss. That was not it. We're getting started. We're just getting started. Because the moment they get Ron Artest back to the court, he turns and two Pistons fans, and it's really just the dumb. I can't understand like how you could make this dumb of a decision. But two Pistons fans, who they were named in the documentary, AJ Shackelford and Charlie Haddad, come towards Ron Artest. They have made their way to the court. Someone, like there's obviously no security at this point, have allowed the fans to make their way to the court, and they're clenching fist and approaching Ron Artest.
So they get on the court. A couple things that I think I'm glad that they kind of zoomed out, gave us the bigger picture. I'm glad you mentioned that because we now know way more. Just in the last 30 minutes of the documentary, we now know way more than we did from YouTube and from other sources, watching this as it's developed over the last 10, 15 years. But there was 3 cops on the total floor level by that time in the fourth quarter. 3 police officers in the entire city of Detroit. 3 police officers were on floor level. Security, they didn't give a number.
For a 20,000 person arena.
They interviewed all 3 of the police officers. I thought that was really interesting. But we'll keep going through the floor things. I've got a lot of great points about the floor that I took away from it. But just how it got to the point where the 2 that were facing Ron, which, by the way, with a clenched fist, these dudes are like 5'8". Why are you going to walk up to Ron Artest with a clenched fist in that situation? What good is that going to bring? I don't understand the thought process and the logic. Even if you're like, oh yeah, let me just mess with Ron. That's not the guy you mess with at the time, not time or place. So I just thought that was interesting. The reason that they got down there so easily because everybody kind of converged onto that level of the court up into the stands.
Well, so one thing I thought was interesting that they mentioned partially in the documentary, but they kind of swept over it a bit. And from other research I've seen, so these 2 fans were well known to the Pistons organization. They'd had problems with these fans prior to this. They talked about that they had been thinking about revoking these 2 fans' season tickets prior to all of this happening because of drunken and disorderly conduct at games and other things they've done, and because they had made comments in the past about, oh, I wonder if something happened here and I got hurt and I could sue the Pistons. So they were looking for something. And that thing became trying to fight Ron Artest. After this all happened, they did try to sue the Pistons. They didn't win, but they tried. They were the ones that got prosecuted. But still, they come with kind of an attacking stance to Ron Artest, and clearly he goes into defense mode. And the prosecutor in Detroit said Ron Artest is completely justified in hitting AJ Shackelford because Ron Artest takes him out as he's coming toward them. That then causes both fans to kind of hit the floor, both AJ Shackelford and Charlie Haddad. And so now the focus, other people on the court are starting to see what is happening. Jermaine O'Neal in particular. And they start coming that way. Because now, like, the focus was everyone's in the stands and they're trying to pull them out. And there's a lot of problems. It's almost a riot in this direction. And now fans are on the court fighting Ron Artest, which is a whole new problem. And Jermaine O'Neal comes running up because at this point, while Jermaine O'Neal had a lot more patience than Artest and Jackson did, at this point, he's given up with the patience because now the fans have come onto the court to try to attack his teammate. And once again, I'm completely agreeing with Jermaine O'Neal.
We'll touch on that shortly. On
one of the funniest lines is that because Jermaine O'Neal comes in hot with all his force, throwing a punch towards Charlie Haddad, the other Pistons player that's there. And as he's throwing this punch, he steps with his left foot and slips in beer. He hits him in the face, taking him down and injuring him. And Reggie Miller comments, and he said, it's the luckiest time, it is the luckiest moment in Jermaine O'Neal's life. because if he hadn't slipped,
the luckiest miss of his life. He was very clear. He was very clear that Jermaine makes a lot of his high percentage buckets, but that was the one good miss of his career.
Yeah. So the luckiest miss of Jermaine O'Neal's career, because if he doesn't miss, he could have killed this guy.
Reggie was very confident that if he had connected cleanly, that dude's probably not breathing. Whether he's dead or not, I guess we'd find out how fast they respond. But
some of the outside stories people are saying after O'Neal hits Haddad, witnesses that were also around who said they were afraid that Haddad was dead at that point. He wasn't injured nearly that badly, I believe. I don't even believe he broke anything. I believe it was just a very bruised face.
And concussion as well.
And a concussion. So luckily, he wasn't severely injured outside of, he could have been much more injured. And so now that this has happened, it's just a full-scale riot. And like you said, there are 3 police officers. And,
So I want to highlight one of those moments with one of the police officers, because I think as that Jermaine O'Neal thing, you mentioned there's pockets. I think that's a really good way to look at it. Like as the riot starts to kind of develop, I think this is what I learned the most about the post, clip cutting off thing where we start seeing the real footage of it. And I think why they did such a good job in this documentary is as they zoom out and as you see this, what could have been fatal blow, and as you see what could have been, the continuation of the stands, there's also a third pocket of Reggie trying to get over to Jermaine O'Neal. And I think this is my favorite part of the entire documentary in terms of comedic value.
Yeah.
Because you have to find light in this situation. The cop, and I quote, tries to grab as Reggie gets to Ron, right? They try to mace Ron and Jermaine both. And they grab Reggie, who's trying to prevent. Reggie's like, "What are you doing, man?" And the cop is sitting in the place where they interview him in the police station. And he goes, "Reggie was in a suit. I didn't know who it was. I didn't know it was Reggie Miller." And they cut away to I don't remember who said this.
Steven Jackson.
Steven Jackson. He's like, "How you not know Reggie Miller? Reggie Miller, a Pacer. Yeah. How do you not know who Reggie Miller is, suit or not?" And I'm like, that's the best quoted line of this whole documentary. Yeah. This cop, yes, he's in Detroit, but Reggie Miller, bald, beautiful, tall Reggie Miller is in a suit on the court. You have to know who Reggie Miller is. I just thought that was perfect because as that's insinuating, he's coming over to, in the suit and all, trying to defend his teammates. And then the cops come running up to both of them and trying to mace the player. And that's kind of where, and we'll continue on, that's kind of where the domino of the cultural story and the aspect of how this is viewed for the next 10, 15 years. I think that's the beginning point right there when the cop comes up to Ron and Jermaine, who are still trying to defend themselves, and they're the ones that are about to get, detained in some sort, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's a huge turning point for how this story just changes and the domino ends even after the film ends.
Yeah, I think it's a real failure in preparation from the standpoint of the basketball game, preparing the police officers. Because if there's anyone that you need to know who that person is, it's Reggie Miller. It would be like if the police officers also came down the court and were trying to move Larry Bird off the court. It would be like if Larry Bird's there and they're trying to move him out. Well, it's like, how do you know that that's not Larry Bird? Like, how do you know it's not Reggie Miller? That's there. And he's with the team. He's been on the sideline the whole game. You probably let him in. He went past you to come in. It reminds me of a more recent NBA story that reminds me of is after the Raptors won the title in 2019, Masai Ujiri tries to come down onto the court for the celebration with his team. And a security guard essentially tries to detain Masai Ujiri and not let him onto the court post-game, despite the fact that he's showing his credential and he's trying to get on. And that's what it kind of reminded me of is of these security and police not kind of knowing who's supposed to be there. But I can also understand that everything was outrageously crazy, but it's kind of at that point that Reggie Miller states with the officer holding mace up to Jermaine O'Neal and Ron Artest and Reggie Miller, he's like, why are you trying to attack us? Why are you not doing anything about the fans that are rushing onto the court? And he said that's the moment they realized they were on their own. And so they start to run. at that point. Reggie Miller and one of the assistant coaches grab Ron Artest, and they're taking him out. They're taking him off the court. The game is never finished. The last 45 seconds of the game are never played.
Now, just out of curiosity, do we know if did they finish with one less win or loss? Like, did they just give the Pacers the win, I'm assuming?
They said the Pacers won.
Yeah. Okay, they did give them credit for the win. I never actually noticed that part of it. I thought that was
because the game was, they just said the game was, the referees called the game over at that point.
That's what I figured. They were up 15 with like 40 seconds.
They ended the game.
So, yeah.
And they move Ron Artest off, and Steven Jackson kind of makes it through unscathed. Now, I mean, when they're going down the tunnel, fans are dumping every popcorn, all the food, all the drinks are just dumped on the heads of the Pacers players and coaching staff because everything's out of control. The police aren't helping the Pacers. They're just trying to get themselves off the court. And Ron Artest, Reggie Miller, and Steven Jackson are able to get off the court. They're fired up and they're getting to the locker room. Jermaine O'Neal isn't so easily able to get off the court because the rest of them are trying to get off, but then, like you said, it kind of turns into a full-scale riot. The fans kind of converge on the area and are beginning to block the tunnel for the Pacers to get out. And there's a pushing and shoving match. And a fan at that point picks up a chair and throws it and hits Jermaine O'Neal in the head. Other fans are seriously injured because there's kind of a stampeding of fans that's going on. And Jermaine O'Neal starts to go after the fan that threw a chair at him. Again, rightfully so. We're going to get to why I'm so adamantly defending all of these decisions from the Pacers for what comes after. But Jermaine O'Neal kind of goes after this fan, and it's kind of just a hodgepodge of people who are kind of crunched together, and they're eventually able to bring him out and bring him to the locker room. And they're able to get the people off the court, and the situation finally dies down.
We're talking close to an hour and a half in total in terms of just finally guys in the locker room, fans leaving. I mean, obviously ambulances showing up, police officers everywhere by the time they had called half the city of Detroit's police department is what they quoted on that documentary. I'm glad that you highlighted the chair because looking back on it, when they zoom out, I used the zoom out analogy because that's really what they did multiple times. Actually, they literally zoomed out and showed you like live grainy footage from like the ceiling basically of certain things that happen. I think the chair thing, again, like another perfect example of what we don't know and don't see unless this documentary is made the way it is. I think a lot of people don't realize like that guy was charged with assault.
Yeah. Well,
rightfully so. Every bit of it was.
The beer that was thrown was assault.
Everything.
Shackelford and Haddad, who hit the court, it was attempted assault or threatening.
They got it off a little easier, for sure.
Yeah. I believe they said everyone got some type of probation or community service except for John Green, who spent a period of time, I think had to spend a period of time, maybe 30 days or something in prison for the assault. Like they came after John Green with that. And so like you said, they get back to the locker room and Ron Artest delivers the funny line you mentioned to looking at Steve Jackson saying, "Are we going to get in trouble for this?" And the answer was yes, because then we hit to the aftermath of everything that happens, because then everyone wakes up the next day. And every news station, now we're not talking every sport, we're not just talking ESPN. ESPN, of course, is just covering this and covering nothing else. But every news station is talking about the fact that Ron Artest, Steven Jackson, and Jermaine O'Neal attacked Pistons fans the night before in an NBA game. And what has to be very clear is that's the narrative that's being dealt, is that Ron Artest, Steven Jackson, and Jermaine O'Neal attacked fans at a game. The whole story we told isn't told because, like you said, there's very grainy footage of everything that happens. And all that people are seeing is they start with, it looks like something hits Ron Artest, but he runs in the stands and viciously attacks these fans. And so the narrative very quickly turns on these guys. What's kind of parried around, and it's one thing I want to really mention, because they didn't linger on it in the documentary, but I thought the point was very much there. They are repeatedly calling them thugs. They talk about the NBA needs to change. There's this thug mentality with the players. They're thugs. It's the hip hop culture of the NBA, a word that these news anchors are throwing around, saying the NBA needs to change. They need to bring the hammer down on these guys. And it flashes back to Jermaine O'Neal, who I love listening from throughout the entirety of this documentary. And I don't remember if it was him or Steven Jackson that says that now that I think about it, but they continue to say these thugs, they're getting into fights, yada yada. And they say hockey players are beating each other up all the time, and they don't seem to be caring about that. Sure. It's very clear here, especially from the word thug, is it's a very racially charged situation. These are almost all white news anchors who are making assumptions about these African-American players who got in a fight with white fans. And the players are immediately turned on in the situation. Players who, I'm not saying everything was done correctly. I'm not saying Ron Artest should have gone in the stands, but I understand why he did, and I can't blame him for it. Jermaine O'Neal, I really feel bad for in the situation, because all Jermaine O'Neal did was defend himself and his teammates from the court in a riot where he was being attacked.
Yeah, we'll touch on him in detail soon.
The fans are treated like they're innocent in this situation, and it's the players who are attacked in the eyes of the media, and are the ones who are going to get the repercussions that come forth from it from David Stern.
So this is one of two reasons I'm glad we talked about this, because one, I think it's not only a blemish in terms of the NBA and how they handled it. I think they handled it in a good and bad way at the same time, and I'll divulge in a moment. What I mean by that is it implemented a couple of things that we still see today. Obviously, with the harsh punishment, I opened the episode with David Stern, right? And he's kind of the end-all, be-all of how this kind of transitions from NBA to then obviously in the courtroom, right? So it goes from how the NBA handles it, and then for another year and a half almost, how the legal system takes care of the players and the fans, of course, right? But I think we can't brush over the fact that it's just a huge blemish on the media. Like, it's disgusting. As two people who are new to the media world and new to how we want to do things, like, yeah, I mean, it's exactly that. It's exactly the painting the picture of the thug mentality. And the NBA had to use that and take that how they must, because they implemented a dress code we still see today.
Yeah.
The basis of it, right? We still have implemented, they've implemented certain changes of the dress code, but like, I'm sure people wonder where the dress code came from if they don't know. Guys who are, think about the Steph Curry generation, who has, our younger siblings age and a little bit older, right? Or a little bit younger. Like, they don't understand why the players have this certain, they have the dress code has loosened up, right? As they want to market their players, that's a way they can do that. Mm-hmm. But this was a huge, this is where I kind of transitioned from just the discussing part of the media to the NBA really in two ways cracked down on this and was whether they liked it or not, they had to make a stand. And I think what I'm really glad the documentary did is they highlighted why. Mm-hmm. The fans pay their paychecks.
Yeah.
So they had to do what they had to do and handed out the following. Artest received the longest suspension in NBA history. 86 total games. I don't think people realize that's over a season long, right? That's 82 full games and then 4 extra, right? As well as Steven Jackson received 30 for his total involvement. Jermaine O'Neal received 15. Hall of Famer Ben Wallace, by the way, received 6. Anthony Johnson, a role player, received 5. Reggie Miller received 1. Why, I don't really know.
What did Reggie do?
Hold on, it gets better. Derek Coleman received 1 as well. Chauncey Billups, which, by the way, was not mentioned once in this entire documentary, in involvement in some way, received a game. And Eldon Campbell as well received a game of suspension. So over 2 seasons almost or up to 2 seasons worth of suspensions given out in totality. And I think that's really just, I mentioned like Stern and how he handled things. He was quoted saying, he was asked, like, what was the vote on this? It was unanimous. He goes, yeah, it was 1-0.
I think this is, like you said at the beginning, this is one of those black marks on the David Stern tenure as the NBA commissioner, because frankly, suspensions were going to come, right? Rightfully, because you can't have something like this happen without suspensions coming. And the players talk about that. They realize suspensions were going to come. But these suspensions were egregious for what happened. And it was really the NBA kind of cowering to this media sentiment. You talked about the dress code. What does what they dress like have anything to do with what happened in Detroit? It doesn't have anything to do with it at all. But it was changed as a result of the media painting these players as thugs. Players like Jermaine O'Neal, who really just defended himself. It was just a situation, and 3 players, I think, that were done really unjustly in the moment. I'm not saying that Artest and Jackson shouldn't have been suspended. They should have been. But 86 games for Artest, 30 games from Jackson. 30 games is 40% of a season. He was suspended most of the season. Artest never played for the Pacers again.
He was traded the following season. Yep.
He requested a trade and got out of Indiana the following season. The Pacers obviously didn't win the title. The team was, it was cut off at the knees by their 3 best players being suspended. They weren't able to ever recover from that as the season went along. And at the end of that year, Reggie Miller hung up his boots and left the great sport of basketball.
So just understanding the full landscape of like how, like we've already addressed like the coupling on top of the dress code and how it really just glorified the narrative, but really just understanding like the full scale of not only the legal impact. We mentioned how, and the documentary, I don't want to touch on the legal part of it too much because there's a lot more explained properly things by the legal professionals in the documentary. I think they do a really good job of explaining what they did, how they found the things they did. It took them like a month, by the way, to find John Green. Just like side note from like an hour ago. But all in all, I think what I really took away coming down to like how it shaped, like obviously Reggie Miller was in his 18th year, but to like tie it back to basketball, you mentioned this, like the Pacers were not winning the title whatsoever after that moment. Like it was the moment that happened. That was,
and to be clear, in that game prior to the fight that happens with 45 seconds left, or the shoving match, the Pacers are far and away the favorite. They look like they're going to win the title.
Mm-hmm. And they haven't been back to that point in an Eastern Conference Finals since Paul George and that team playing the Heat in 2011, 12, and 13. But lastly, like, it's just a sad, you mentioned the Reggie Miller thing. Like, it's a sad, disgusting way for Reggie Miller to end such a famous career. And he's going to go down as a guy who's forgotten for not winning a title, right? You're going to look at shooting guards all time. He's one of the greatest shooters of all time. But, like, his tier of his Hall of Fame status, his tier of his all-time ranking as the 75 greatest players are going to be announced here in the next couple months with the NBA 75th season, which I'm excited, by the way, for you and I to just critique that list entirely. Mm-hmm. But Reggie Miller, like, he's going to be in it, I would assume, or I would hope. But, like, his resume kind of gets that little asterisk tarnish. Mm-hmm. And I hate it for him. He's one of them, like, there's so many people, like, that you ask, like, from that era, from about, like, late 90 that weren't, Jordan fans, et cetera, or, like, weren't, or fans of other teams that weren't Michael Jordan, right? And they highlight Reggie Miller. They really give him credit for a lot of fandom, obviously for the California, aspect of his career. He's a very beloved person in that area. People love Reggie Miller, and I hate that for him. I really do. I guess I kind of want your final thoughts, but this wouldn't be a Two Pointers podcast without me having a question for you. And as this documentary, of course, does a really great job of showing everything, my question is basically an in conclusion question. So if you have any more thoughts or obviously any more things on what kind of took place afterwards, otherwise I have the question for you.
I will say who I feel bad for is Jermaine O'Neal. Jermaine O'Neal and Reggie Miller. It's because at the end of the day, Ron Artest and Steven Jackson are able to move on. They have great careers. They both end up winning titles in different situations. Artest wins in LA with the Lakers on those late Kobe Bryant teams. And Steven Jackson wins as a role player in San Antonio with the Tim Duncan, Tony Parker, Manu Ginobili teams. Jermaine O'Neal stuck it out in Indiana afterwards. He didn't leave. And the team really wasn't able to recover. He was kind of the leader who went down with the ship with the team. You know, there's any guy that was really hit poorly in this, because Jermaine O'Neal is someone who, frankly, going back to the suspensions, I don't think he should have been suspended at all. He was put in a terrible situation. The security at the game were not protecting the players on the court. And he was placed in this terrible situation where he had to make decisions, and he gets treated really poorly at the end of it.
Yeah, so a couple things. Like, that's a great kind of, it sounds like we're obviously wrapping up here, and we can kind of get our fans' thoughts here in the next following weeks watching the documentary. But I think in just the judgment, I think we both came to a similar conclusion on the fact that my question for you was, and I'll kind of divulge why in a moment, but who overall, if you look at career basketball-wise, who was the most effective was my question. And I think we can unanimously say it's Jermaine O'Neal.
Yeah.
Jermaine O'Neal, who basically from that point on, you know, I don't think he ever made another All-Star game. And then at that point, the most I remember Jermaine O'Neal, as scary as this is for dating us here, we've never obviously said our actual age, but I remember him on the Celtics, right? I remember him on those trying Celtics teams in the late 2010s or late 2000s. I also don't, I mean, I'm glad, I don't want to spoil the documentary, but like Jermaine was given 25 games originally, but he took it all the way through the legal battle. It got all the way up to the highest level of court, to the United States District Court. And they heard his appeal and deemed it completely legitimate that he did what he did. And he was given 15. And I think, obviously, that's kind of spoiling the ending of the documentary, but I'm glad that they highlight that. I'm glad that he highlights that. He's obviously, you mentioned him having an integral part in this documentary, in it physically, but he also is a producer. He's the lead producer of this documentary. He's been working on stuff like this. That's kind of what he's taken up out after basketball, is doing a lot of films and things like that. But this was kind of the one token piece for him. So I'm glad that they highlighted that. We obviously completely agree on who was affected the most, but I just think overall, like, you can really do a lot of what if scenarios on what if this doesn't happen, right? Like, you can look at some guys' careers and be like, you know, even teams like the Pacers, right? Like, the legacy of some of these players. Larry Bird's not looked at as a great president and GM, and look at how that could have turned out differently with a title. Things like that.
We pointed out, Reggie Miller was older, but Steven Jackson, Ron Artest, and Jermaine O'Neal were very young. And if this doesn't happen, the team probably doesn't blow up. They probably win the title. The team stays together. Reggie probably doesn't retire at the end of that season. So he talked about that after all this happened, he decided it was time to hang it up. Reggie could have played a couple more seasons. And this Pacers team is probably a dominant franchise in the mid to late 2000s. And all of that went away in a moment.
Lastly, I'll just hit on a few research points that I think were interesting if you had any, but I found a couple. The John Green initial toss was a bet of $50. Like, his friend was basically like, it was a $50 bet to see if he could get that beer there or get that taken care of in that bet. The one that kind of broke my heart the most was Pacers radio announcer Mark Boyle broke 5 vertebrae in the scuffle jumping over the scorer's table. Ron Artest basically stepped on his back and broke 5 vertebrae. Obviously, that's not something you want to hear. Did not know Tim Donaghy worked that game. I thought that was very interesting. He has some quotable lines in there. I'll let the fans figure out what I mean by that. And then just a cool little like NBA history. I told you there's always these weird moments with NBA history. This is my final thing. we saw this transition. This was, like I mentioned, and this is like my biggest takeaway is just how it shaped NBA history and how it shaped certain aspects of the following years. But David Stern, this was kind of, like I said, his last big thing he had to overcome after 30 plus years as the commissioner. Adam Silver was in charge at the time of the NBA entertainment, or what they called it. He was the president of the entertainment board for the NBA, which, to spoil what that means, his job was to collect video of games and of incidents and of other things, right? Highlights, etc. And Adam Silver was the lead person in gathering evidence for this case for the legal team. So full circle here as we transition from Stern to, at the time, Adam wasn't the deputy yet, so he wasn't the guy, right? Yeah. So I always thought that was neat that he was the guy that kind of helped them gather as much evidence as they could for this case, and ultimately made decisions legally. So, and now, of course, Adam Silver's the reigning commissioner. So that's my last thought. I just thought that was interesting. There was a lot of cool things if you just really did some digging. All in all, just probably one of the most overlooked stories, and I'm glad. I think that's really why we highlighted it.
Yeah, it was one of the wildest tales, kind of, in the mid-2000s in the NBA. It's one that, I mean, as you saw with the NBA suspensions that were doled out, it's one that they want to forget happened. But it really puts everything with the climate with fans throwing things at players now. Fan spitting on Trae Young, a fan throwing a water bottle at Kyrie Irving. It puts everything in perspective now, what that climate is around fans throwing things, and to why that's such a big issue.
All right. Well, Josh, this has been a great, I'm excited as the offseason is here. I told you we've got plenty of great ideas, trivia shows possibly in the future, more breakdowns of stories that we find interesting. I think there's a lot of good content that we have coming for you. We've basically got 8 full episodes essentially until the NBA really starts, Matt. Probably 6, give or take, that are off-season oriented or centric that we then have to start gearing up with the top 75 players list and our thoughts on the season. Obviously, the dreadful season preview where we have to preview all 15 teams, and there's just going to be a lot to it, right? So
all 30 teams, you mean?
All 30 teams, 15 on each side. Sorry, thank you. It's been a long week. I am excited because this is just the start of some fun content for us this summer. But just wanted to throw out there. Lastly, obviously, check us out on Twitter. Never forget to follow us there at 2Pointers, as well as on TikTok at the 2Pointers Podcast, Facebook, all the places you would find social media for us. We also want to make sure you check us out on SportsWire Sports Radio, recent name change of Sports and Sportinarium. From what I understand, talking to Thomas, it was basically just, it's hard to spell and pronounce. So it was
I agree.
A little bit of a marketing move there. I like it. I also like the new logo. So if you guys haven't checked that out, obviously on Twitter, SportsWire Sports Radio. But Josh, it's been fun. Any final thoughts on off season and Malice at the Palace?
If there are other NBA stories or college basketball stories or basketball stories that you want to hear us talk about, recommend them to us on Twitter, put it in the comments here. Give us other things that we'll talk about, and we might make an episode out of it. But with that being said, this has been the 2Pointers Podcast. I'm Josh.
I'm Trevor.
And we will see you soon.